on this computer. Now, this is what I learned yesterday. That's what I should have done. Okay, we are recording now. So we are just going to edit this. Welcome everyone to our in-house discussion on the impact of the pandemic on global economy. A few years back, I was teaching a course on national security and more specifically on the response to unpredictable acts, occurrences, and circumstances. My students were people who wanted to embrace a career of administrators managing and conducting critical response. Among many scenarios explored was the possibility of an invisible enemy, a germ warfare, pandemic scenarios. My students at that time looked at me like I was an alien from another galaxy. One of the workshops related to the selection of the stages of response, stages of isolation, including cutting some areas off to save lives. That was very difficult. And in short, the workshop asked vital but very uncomfortable questions about how do we put a value on human lives and their livelihoods? How do we determine who and what we save? And what are the acceptable costs and versus outcomes, of course? Those are the questions and decisions that today every government is faced with. There are no right and no wrong answers, and certainly there are no easy answers. It's just either bad response or good response, or at least we hope so. So what comes first? Humans, our life, or economy? Perhaps a combination of both? So let's look at the current global situations. Since Global Initiatives and Solutions is a Scottish think tank, apart from the global situation, we will also like to examine issues that we face here in Scotland and of course in the wider context in the UK. And let's not forget about Brexit, possibly a lethal complication on top of already grave situation. To help us answer some of the questions and understand the mechanisms of response, as well as the way forward in the new normal that is here to stay, we enlisted help of Ottaviano Canuto, who is joining us from Washington, DC. Our guest is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, non-resident senior fellow at Brookings Institution, a visiting public policy fellow at ILAS Columbia, and a principal at the Center for Macroeconomics and Development. Throughout his career, Ottaviano served as the Vice President and Executive Director at the World Bank, Executive President and Director at the International Monetary Fund, and Vice President at the Inter-American Development Bank, among other roles. Back in his native Brazil, he held an office of a Deputy Minister for International Affairs at Brazil's Ministry of Finance. He's also a former professor of economics at University of Sao Paulo and University of Campinas in Brazil. And let me introduce also our discussion group. Anne Jensen, Anna, she's an educator, business leader, and strategic planner. She's also the Director of Business Department at Global Initiatives and Solutions. Stephen McPhee, international banker and financier, economist and chartered accountant. He's at the helm of our international operations at Global. Mike Stevenson, the Director of our Department of Society and Governance, an entrepreneur and communicator, TEDx and LeaderCast motivational speaker. And I am Margaret Guskov-Walsh, the founder, director, and the CEO of Global Initiatives and Solutions. We are the interdisciplinary think tank based in Edinburgh, specializing in solving multidimensional problems. We design and monitor new and ambitious programs and solutions intended for determined institutions, corporations, and SMEs, as well as for individual clients worldwide. Advocate practical approach and analysis of all factors instrumental to harmonious interdisciplinary functioning of the society at all levels, and the delivery of short and long-term practical and applicable solutions. We focus on mitigation and management of business, personal, social, economic, and political risks, especially those resulting from unpredictable situations. And such a situation we have right now. And with that, I would like to leave the mic to Ottaviano, who should unmute himself because we are all muted, and please take us through it.
Thank you. Thank you indeed, Margaret, for having me here. It's really a pleasure. But by outlining a picture of where we are now with respect to the global crisis derived from the COVID-19. This is the worst crisis since the Great Depression, and it will take some time before it ends because the COVID-19 pandemic used to spread, and with it, the economic effects of supply and that is to say, mobility restrictions affect the use of capacity. And on the side of demand, voluntary or mandatory social distancing is impacting the demand for contact-intensive service. As a result of the easing of lockdowns and the rapid policy support by public sectors all over the world, at an unprecedented scale by central banks and governments, the global economy is coming back from the depths in the first half of this year. Employment has partially rebounded after having plummeted during this, but the crisis is, however, far from over, as we know, as we are watching second wave in many places, and also because even the effects of the first wave are not dismissed entirely. Employment is still well below the pre-pandemic levels, and it has become more polarized with low-income workers, youth, and women being harder hit. Are getting poorer, with close to 90 million people expected to fall into extreme deprivation. See a bit of this, a couple of slides ahead. But the 19 pandemic will also accelerate change in the world economy. It's not that the pandemic is changing that much history, although it will have some permanent effects. But the point is that 4 features of the post-pandemic global economy can already be anticipated, and they were there, and COVID-19 is accelerating them. Well, first, the worldwide public and private debt levels. That's going to be, to different degrees, a common feature of the world. 2, accelerated digitization. Of course, the possibilities of digitization were already a tendency. Some of the technologies were already developed, but the COVID-19 has accelerated this process. Income concentration, the impact will be an increase in income inequality in all the countries. And 4th, a partial reversal of globalization. So in this sense, the accelerating history. Margaret, could you please put the next, that other slide, please? The following one. Yes, okay. So I will touch on these. Yeah, great. Look, this is taken from the World Economic Outlook produced by the IMF that was released the other Sunday, and it shows clearly how things are terrible when it comes to the economic impact of the coronavirus. The red line is the one for China, the red lines, and is there. The dashed lines show what would be the trajectory of GDP in sets of countries prior to COVID, based on, let's say, the forecasts that the IMF was having presented by January, for instance. And as that's in all three cases, advanced economies and the emerging markets and developing economies, except for China. And as we can see, the COVID-19 has been a tremendous shock on the three groups of countries. China first in, and given the effectiveness of the pandemic policies adopted in China, they managed to, let's say, to curb and return faster to full economic activity. There is also the fact that China has a substantial share of its GDP done by corresponding to manufacturing, and those countries who happen to be more dependent on manufacturing could return to activity easier because the major shock of the COVID-19 is on the demand side, as I said, contact intensive service. That's why, including the figures here for emerging market economies, they are, let's say, an average, and they hide a huge disparity among regions. In the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, for instance, where the contact intensive service are of the GDP, the impact has been much worse than elsewhere, than emerging Asia and so on. So this average here hides, the Latin America and the Caribbean has been the region in the world. Let me highlight the following. Even China, as you can, will not be able, let's say, to replicate the trajectory that would come without COVID. That will suffer the impact of the rest of the world on its exports, and that's why even will not be the same as prior to COVID. But you can also how the impact on both emerging markets and developing economies. In most cases, really with only a few exceptions, at the end of next year, none of them will be able to be at a better place than last year, 2019. So it's a dramatic effect. As you can see here, is a difference corresponding to 8.1% in the case of emerging markets and developing economies, and 4.7 percentage points in the case of domestic economies. So no one will recover clearly at the end of next year. Margaret, please. Thank you.
This one?
No, let me lay out a couple. Yes, good, thank you. One important consequence of the COVID will be an intensification of a trend that was already in place, which is illustrated in this chart, showing evolution of the 10-year benchmark rate of interest in real terms, discounting inflation, in this cluster of advanced economies. And as we can see, there has a tendency over the last decades of falling real interest rates. And do with a couple of factors. There are several hypotheses for this. I suggest a reading of a recent that I posted on this British magazine, Capital Finance International. And clearly, there has been a mismatch between the amount of financial wealth and opportunities to find assets, and this has expressed itself in this declining exhibited by real interest rates. Now, COVID-19 will intensify this. It happened in other historical experiences with pandemics. Those who can are saving more for precautionary reasons, and also on the policy side, the need to have to sustain the kind of very monetary policy is something that will stay for Federal Reserve, the ECB, the Bank of England, and the Bank of Japan and Switzerland. They will much supportive of the financial side to avoid catastrophes and so on. And by the way, of course, those forecasts that I showed previously, they assumed no second waves. So a square root, as we saw, we may even have more of a WU. Okay. Important information to keep in mind is the impact on extreme poverty. This is made by some colleagues of mine at Brookings, showing how, prior to COVID, there was a perspective, the forecast of a declining number of declining percentage of the world population living in extreme poverty. That is to say, living with less than $1.9 per day. But now, with COVID, those figures went up, as you can see. We have an increase in that number of people, proportion of the world population living under those extreme conditions. And obviously, it goes back to declining in the future. They will remain at higher levels than otherwise. Next, please. Margaret.
This one?
Thank you. So we
are
yes,
talking about,
please. Great, yes. Fantastic. So fantastic. I mentioned the rising public debt, and they won't necessarily become explosive in the case of advanced economies because they count on the maintenance of low interest. That's not necessarily the case in some of the emerging markets and developing economies. Brazil is facing doubts about the fiscal trajectory. In the case of sub-Saharan countries, some of them will inevitably go into default and or restructuring. So much on the public debt. Let me say something now about the digitization. Of course, we have winners and losers when it comes to the economic sectors. Overall is a disaster. COVID-19 is a disaster, but for some economic sectors, it's been a boon. That's the case of technology, high tech, and healthcare for obvious reasons. Whereas anything intensive in people contact, they're on a trajectory. Hospitality, restaurants, hotels, personal service, they are in a state of disaster. And this is reflected, including in the stock markets, the asynchrony, or let's say the disconnect of the US stock markets vis-a-vis the real side of the economy is explained particularly by the performance of tech-related stocks. There was some adjustment in September. We saw some turbulence in the last few days, but the fact of the matter is that the prospects differentiated by sectors is something to be taken into account. And this has a reflection on the labor markets, of course. It's impressive. I saw an estimate that now during the lockdowns or the equivalent to lockdowns in the US. That is to say, people working from home, those who can. 2/3 of the US GDP in May, June was produced from home, just to give an idea how, of course, that doesn't mean that 2/3 of the US population were producing, but the fact of the matter is that the shift has accelerated dramatically, and the effects on the labor markets are accordingly very much differentiated. Everybody suffered. As you can see on the right side of the chart, both high wage and low wage workers have felt an impact, but it has been even higher in the case of low wage workers. The point is that, as I said at the beginning, coronavirus is also worsening income distribution. It's also providing an impact. And I guess this is the last one, but let me see. I mentioned the income concentration. I mentioned the public debt together with the low interest rates. I mentioned now the differentiated impacts on sectors and on labor markets. But there's also the question about trade. Again, there was a trend towards a relative reduction of a partial reversal of globalization. Trade after the global financial crisis has not maintained the dynamics that it had in the previous decades, a bit because China was rebalancing, also because there was more protectionism, and then we had the trade wars and so on. Now, will COVID accentuate this? Yes, to some extent. The perceived vulnerability of global value chains to shocks may lead in some sectors to diversification, to, let's say, global value chains trying to develop alternative paths so as to minimize the vulnerability to shocks. But this comes with a cost. This comes with a cost, of course, because otherwise the global value chains would not have the configuration that they have. And I don't believe there will be an overall drive by global value chains from the sector perspective towards changing that much. Only maybe in some sectors that may be more vulnerable to shocks. But it's on the politics side, it's on the policy side, and that remits me to, let's say, what one may call the state in the new normal, one in which the political drive may lead to policies affecting global value chains, which is an accentuation of what we saw in the trade wars practiced by Mr. Trump against China and all the others. Mr. Macron, who said one of the first things that he said was, well, time has come to redefine the line of the strategic sectors. We know that definitely medicaments or medical equipment will be there. Everyone got scared with the initiatives taken by China at the very beginning, India, who suspended exports and so on. So in that case, I believe there will be a shift towards lower trade, towards onshoring of activities and so on. But how far will it go? I don't believe the Americans, even if Trump wins the re-election, that he would try to bring back shoe production to the US. But he will definitely do so in the case of equipment associated with high technology sectors. So yeah, coronavirus has been a disaster. And in all situations of catastrophe, the only insurer resort is the state. So this newly acquired profile of the state will stay for is an outcome of the COVID-19. What concerns me, among other things, not only myself, but many people, is that this inward orientation of as part of the response to COVID-19, the war for equipments, for protection equipments and so on, this inward orientation of countries will, let's say, has intensified the crisis of multilateralism, as we are watching clearly in the case of the WTO and in other respects, at a time when some of the major challenges faced by mankind will demand more than ever, more than before, cooperation, multilateral cooperation. Think of climate change. The response, what the world needs to do with respect to climate change cannot rely simply on individual actions and so on. So the more we move towards things like the Paris Agreement, the better. And the first thing that Trump did was to leave the Paris Agreement. Take it, cybersecurity. Doing actions in cybersecurity will be more difficult if the countries do not establish some degree of cooperation, of exchange of information, of measures, and so on. Take terrorism, right? Take dealing with the demographic change, the pattern of demographic change. Migration, or the trends, the push, the pressures of migration will stay. No matter if you put the walls like President Trump wanted in Mexico, right? But the pressure coming from of delocation of people from areas to others, from people to other areas will stay. Among other reasons, because of climate change. Climate change will affect negatively, particularly parts of sub-Saharan Africa. People will have no option but to move. And so we better have more cooperative efforts in that regard. So these are, I guess I mentioned them all, the challenge that I would say one may anticipate from the COVID-19. Sorry, I spoke too long.
No, absolutely. It's always fascinating to hear your take on it. I mean, you have so much more insight and such a depth in explaining that. It's just great. We stop the screen sharing right now and make sure that we are recording.